Hello, everyone, and welcome to our last event of the Tech in the City series. Today's guest, Marx, will assess the past decade of transportation failures and argue that we don't need a different orientation towards transport if we are to solve key problems like road deaths, traffic, and emissions. My name is Jerica Logan, and I am the Outreach Coordinator at the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis, otherwise known as CURA. I will be your host for this event. If you require closed captioning, you will find a box at the bottom of the screen called CC. Click the box and select Show Subtitles. This will allow you to see the subtitles during the presentation. Please feel free to submit questions at any time in the webinar using the Q&A box. We will ask as many of your questions as we can in the last portion of the presentation, and if we do not get to your question, we do apologize. If you have any questions following the event, please feel free to email me at logan.433@osu.edu. This event is approved for one AICP CM credit. To claim your CM credits, log into your My APA account on the APA website and enter in your event into your CM event log. There will also be a brief survey at the end of this webinar. If you do have time, please provide your feedback. I am now going to pass it over to our director, Harvey Miller.
Okay, thank you, Jerica, and welcome to today's webinar. This is the final event in our series we've had all academic year, on Tech in the City, the promises and perils of using technology to meet the challenge of an urban planet. And we're happy to have Marx here today. But before we get into his talk, I would like to tell you about some of our future events coming up. This summer, we have an event series, a webinar series called Race in Place, Learning from the Past and Looking to the Future. Our first webinar in that series will be May 12th, and we'll have Michael Corey from the Mapping Prejudice Project at the University of Minnesota. He will talk about the history of racial covenants and how they developed into a powerful technology of segregation. He will also demonstrate the deed machine, the custom-built software that has allowed Mapping Prejudice to break a decades-long research logjam. That'll be a really exciting event on May 12th. And I want to give you a little teaser for our autumn series in CURA. We'll have a webinar series called Just Streets, Safe and Equitable Mobility in Our Communities. We're going to invite transportation scholars, social justice advocates, and community engagement leaders to look at both the safety and social justice impacts of how we design and manage our streets in our communities. This is still under development, so stay tuned for that one. You can visit cura.osu.edu/events to learn about this and other future events. You could sign up for our monthly newsletter at cura.osu.edu. You can like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram. You can also follow us on Twitter. We're still there. We'll be there until they experience a rapid unscheduled disassembly or something like that. But that way, you'll never miss any of the great events happening at your friendly neighborhood Center for Urban and Regional Analysis at The Ohio State University. So now to our speaker today, Marx. Marx is a Canadian tech critic, author of Road to Nowhere, What Silicon Valley Gets Wrong About the Future of Transportation. And they're also host of the award-winning Tech Won't Save Us podcast. Their work has been published in Time, Wired, NBC News, CBC News, and many other media outlets. Their work has been translated into more than 10 languages. Paris earned a master's degree in urban geography from McGill University, researching Silicon Valley's efforts to transform how we move. They've also spoken internationally about the future of transportation. So with that, Paris, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Harvey, and thanks to Jerica as well for inviting me and for hosting this, putting it all together. Just bringing up my slides here, and then we will get started. So the presentation I'm giving today is based on research that I did in my master's degree. Writing that I have been doing before that and have been doing, ever since, and a book that I wrote called Road to Nowhere, What Silicon Valley Gets Wrong About the Future of Transportation, that, digs into all of these issues. And so, over the next half hour, I'll be going through a bunch of pieces of that. Obviously, I won't get to all of it, but feel free to ask me further questions afterward. Happy to address, more aspects of this then. And so I want to start by talking a bit about the history of kind of where the car comes from before we talk about Silicon Valley's response to what is going on right now. And so when we go back to the late 1800s, the early 1900s, this is the period when the car is really emerging, right? And if we think back to that today, it can be easy to think that, okay, you know, there's this new technology that's invented called the automobile, and it rolls out onto the streets, and naturally that this is just, you know, how things change, right? We get rid of the horse and buggy, we get rid of the streetcars, and the car takes over. But actually, when we look back at that history, we can see that it was a very contentious process that faced a lot of fierce opposition, because the car was something that was for wealthy people, right? The people who were buying it initially were the higher class people in society, and they were entering this kind of road space, road atmosphere, where you had people getting around in many different ways, from walking to cycling to streetcars to, you know, horse-drawn carriages, et cetera, et cetera. They were all moving kind of relatively slowly. They were all kind of navigating the space, not perfectly, but you know, it worked, right? And then the automobile enters, it's going faster. It's kind of operating in a different way than some of these other forms of transportation. And what you see very quickly is that the number of people being injured and the number of people dying on the streets starts to increase very quickly. And young people and young women in particular are you know, most affected by that. And so there's a backlash in particular by the working class people in cities who say, you know, this is something that this is kind of a benefit that's being enjoyed by the wealthy in cities, and it's hurting all of us, and it's changing the way that we kind of live in our communities, right? And so that is kind of the nature of this backlash that happens, where there's big kind of funeral parades. When people die, they ring the bells on churches and fire halls on the days that people die to kind of draw attention to this. There's kind of propaganda drawn up to show the car as the modern Moloch that requires kind of child sacrifice and stuff. Like, you know, a lot of opposition that would seem very weird to us today, where so many of us are dependent on cars, right? And so part of that is, you know, part of what ultimately happens, we know, obviously the car takes over. And part of that is kind of changing the way that people think about streets and think about transportation, demonizing people who cross the streets in the wrong places, jaywalkers, and ultimately, you know, over time, taking away those alternatives, those alternative means of getting around, and basically requiring people to own a car in order to transport themselves in a city. And that is done in many ways. And the government, the state, plays a key role in that. And so I want to talk about a few different aspects of that in the United States. You know, we can go back to 1933 and Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, where there's a lot of investments in roads, airports, bridges, and other infrastructure. You know, there's highways that are built in that period as well. So you're seeing the beginnings of kind of investment in this kind of infrastructure for automobiles. You also have the creation of the Federal Housing Authority in 1934, and that is what kind of offers mortgage insurance to a lot more people, so that it becomes easier for white people in particular to buy homes, because of course, as we know, there's a lot of redlining that occurs in cities that ensures that a lot of Black people are not able to access mortgages and home ownership and the wealth and things that come with all of that. So, you know, that's an important thing to understand, that that is kind of the beginnings of, you know, moving toward this kind of car-centric, suburban kind of living model. And then if we move forward, you know, after the Second World War in 1956, we have the interstate highway system which, you know, happens under President Eisenhower. You know, that is over 48,000 miles of highway that is built during that period at an estimated cost of over $500 billion. And of course, you know, the map that you see behind my slide is the map of the interstate highway system. So it's this massive project that is, you know, is not only an infrastructure project that creates a lot of jobs and whatnot, but also kind of puts a greater focus on cars as being the way that people are going to get around into the future, rather than rail and, you know, other forms of transportation, right? And then even if we move ahead again to 1986, we can see in President Ronald Reagan's tax reform that the top income tax rate is cut from 50% to 38%. So, you know, wealthier people are getting a lot more money. The depreciation subsidy for apartment construction is eliminated. So that's less incentive to invest in apartment construction, more incentive to invest in single family homes. The low income housing tax credit is introduced. They increase the mortgage interest deduction. So there are, further measures to incentivize home ownership or people living in single family homes, and less incentive on public housing and on kind of apartment living and things like that. And so this plays into this larger kind of effort. We see that there are subsidies and bailouts for automakers over the years, in 2008 in particular, tax credits for vehicle purchases, as we see now with electric vehicles, free parking across many cities. It's a subsidy for drivers to encourage people to get around in that way. It also forces us to build our communities, more spread out. And of course, there's billions in subsidies for fossil fuels that still occur. And that's not to mention, the wars that are fought in the name of protecting access to fossil fuels. And so if we look about what that has meant for our cities, there are a lot of deaths and injuries from automobile crashes in the United States. It's over 40,000 people a year who die because of cars, and many more than that get injured. There's a significant time lost stuck in traffic. So, in major cities, people lose days of their lives every year because they're sitting in traffic. There's negative health effects from not just sedentary living and sprawl, being in these communities that are so spread out and having to spend so much time in cars. And of course, there's the environmental footprint where we lose a lot of green space. There's the emissions from driving and the other kind of effects of this. There's also an inequitable kind of pattern of development that comes from this because, certain people can afford to live in certain areas to own cars and whatnot. And then other people, can't access those things as well, might have to wait for long periods of time to get on the bus. And then, of course, there's the high cost of maintenance and service delivery. When we spread people out over such a large area and, we are not, we don't have the population density to support all that infrastructure, it becomes much more expensive for us to keep it up. And so recognizing those problems, the tech industry has come in the last, 15 years, about that period of time, and had a lot of ideas for how we are going to address these problems, right? They've recognized that people are getting fed up with being stuck in traffic for so long, that the cost of car ownership and these other issues that I talked about. And so they've proposed a number of ideas. And some of the photos here in the top left is an early concept of the Boring Company, Elon Musk's kind of tunneling company for cars. In the top right is autonomous vehicles, of course. In the bottom right is, or the bottom left, excuse me, is flying cars, this idea that, companies like Uber are going to offer these services where we're going to hop in a helicopter-like vehicle all the time and use that to get around the city. And then, of course, Uber and Lyft and those services. And, there are other, concepts and ideas besides that. If we look at tech's approach to transportation and to these ideas, there's a real focus on their personal grievances, right? That's where a lot of their ideas come from. A lot of Elon Musk's ideas are motivated by the fact that he has been annoyed being stuck in traffic. That's where the Boring Company comes from, this idea that you're going to build a ton of tunnels under cities that cars are going to go into. And of course, his first idea for a tunnel was from his home in Los Angeles to the SpaceX headquarters. We can also look at how their big ideas are not grounded in kind of the fundamentals of transportation. Again, like you can look at the ideas that Elon Musk has had and say, we've experimented for a long time with adding new roads and adding new capacity to roads as a way to address traffic congestion. And that hasn't solved the problem. And we're trying to address that and reckon with that now. There's also a belief that technology alone will solve these transport problems. So forget about that long history that I was just talking about, all the decisions and policies that were put in place to, create this transportation system that we have today. Forget all of that. Let's not have difficult political conversations about these things. All we need is brilliant tech founders to think up these tech solutions, implement them, and this is how we solve the problem, right? And we can see that that is often not, how these things get addressed, and we're not seeing the problems get solved that way. They also tend to overpromise and underdeliver, as we've seen many times, and as we'll discuss. And so I'd like to think of this quote by Andre Gores, a social philosopher, when I think about these things. And he says, the car has made the big city uninhabitable. It has made it stinking, noisy, suffocating, dusty, so congested that nobody wants to go out in the evening anymore. Thus, since cars have killed the city, we need faster cars to escape on superhighways to suburbs that are even farther away. What an impeccable circular argument. Give us more cars so that we can escape the destruction caused by cars. And as we can see that this has kind of been the response to a lot of the issues of, car dependency over the past number of decades. And the tech industry fits into this as well, right? Because there's not really the desire to move us away from cars. It's a desire to find a way to make cars work more efficiently so that we can keep being dependent on them. And so that the tech industry can, get a bit of profit from the system that these other companies are profiting from right now. And so I want to look at a couple examples of this. Again, I'm happy to answer questions about more of these, just to kind of break down how these tech ideas are not actually addressing the serious problem here. So if we look at ride hailing services like Uber or Lyft, they promise that they're going to reduce car ownership, that they're going to connect people up with public transit services, that they're going to reduce vehicle traffic because their technologies are much more efficient, they would say, that they're going to serve underserved communities, and that they'll provide freedom for driver contractors, the people who are delivering the services, these services now that they're not taxi drivers anymore, right? And we can see that a lot of these narratives have serious problems. So if we look at traffic congestion, for example, the studies that have been done on this suggest that 70%, and if you're looking at the slide, TNC is kind of a shorthand for ride hailing services, and VMT is vehicle miles of travel. So, the number of miles being traveled on the road, basically. So that in the 9 largest US metro areas, 70% of US ride hailing trips have actually added, billions of trips and vehicle miles of travel on the road. And, when there's more miles of travel, that means more congestion because cars are on the road for a longer period of time, or more cars are on the road. We can see that private services, so that's, if you just hail an Uber or a Lyft, on your own, add 2.8 vehicle miles of travel for every personal mile of travel that's being replaced there. So if you had driven there on your own, it's adding 2.8 miles for every mile that you would have driven if you'd made that trip yourself. And the shared services, Uber Pool and things like that, where you might share a ride with somebody else, only reduces that very marginally to an additional 2.6 miles of travel. In San Francisco in particular, kind of ground zero for a lot of these ideas, there's 10 times as much vehicle miles of travel from ride hailing services on weekdays as there is for taxis. So they've completely kind of taken over that market. And we see that most of that use of these services are concentrated in the most congested areas of the city, which are also the best served by transit and the most walkable. So it's not really addressing that issue of traffic congestion, right? It's actually making it worse. And the companies have admitted this. And if we look at transit, for example, the effect on transit services, we see that 49% to 61% of ride hailing trips would not have been made at all, or would have been made by walking, biking, or transit. And so what that means is that for those percentage of trips, we're adding more miles to the street. It's making the roads more congested, because if they hadn't existed, people would have been taking those trips in more efficient ways, right? Ways that don't add as much traffic to the road. And these ride-hailing services, when they enter a city, they tend to reduce heavy rail ridership by 1.29% per year, and bus ridership by 1.7% per year. So we know very clearly that when these things enter, they're not complementary with transit. They're actively taking people away from transit. And in many cases, they're making them worse, because if you're adding more congestion to the street and your transit system is mainly based on buses, then those buses are going to be stuck in traffic more often. And so they're going to become less reliable, as a result of that, right? And then who ultimately benefits from these services is the question. We know, based on studies that have been done, that the users of these services are not primarily kind of underserved communities or anything like that. It's college educated people, higher incomes, in the United States, over $70,000 a year, usually. In Toronto, over 100,000 Canadian dollars, usually urban and younger people. And so, I'd like to say, these services are created by tech workers and generally serve people like themselves. Obviously, there are barriers with credit card use and wheelchair accessibility. Uber has campaigned and argued time and time again that it shouldn't have to abide by the Americans with Disabilities Act to ensure that it provides good wheelchair services in the way that taxi services are required to. And that has meant that access to those services is not as good on an Uber. And of course, Black, queer, and trans passengers have reported, a number of issues with using these services in the past, that I would say the companies are not actively addressing. And so we see that in many cases, the promise of ride hailing services has not been fulfilled, and they've actually had many negative impacts on cities and not actually had the benefits that they suggested. And so if we bring that to self-driving cars, which kind of build on this idea of ride hailing services, but say basically instead of a person driving the vehicle, that we're just going to have a computer do it, we can see something similar where they promise that they're going to eliminate car ownership, eliminate parking, drastically reduce, if not eliminate, vehicle deaths. That's a big one there. And of course, they're always only a few years away. Now, of course, they're clearly not, they haven't really arrived yet. Obviously, they're being tested on a few streets around, the world and around the United States, but they're hardly common. They're not as ubiquitous as was kind of being suggested to us. And the real wake-up call with these was in March of 2018, when an Uber test vehicle in Arizona killed Elaine Herzberg. As a result of that, there were leaks that showed that the Uber team was under pressure to catch up to Waymo, which is Google's self-driving division, because they were not performing as well, and because the CEO of the company wanted to show the service off by a certain time, so they were rushing to try to catch up. And the National Transportation Safety Board's report found that there were serious flaws in the system that was actually being used, that the emergency braking was disabled because they didn't want the vehicle kind of stopping on its own regularly, because that would make the kind of experience not that great. And it was also not programmed to consider jaywalking pedestrians. So in this case, Elaine Herzberg was walking across the road at a place where there wasn't a crosswalk, and the Transportation Safety Board's report found that the system wasn't designed to consider that a pedestrian could walk across in a place where there wasn't a crosswalk. And so that's why it couldn't identify who she actually was or what she was to figure out that it needed to stop. And so immediately after that, a lot of the kind of CEOs of these companies, the people who were pushing these technologies, completely shifted on what they were saying. Before that, they were saying, these vehicles, these technologies are going to be ready in just a few years. It's not going to be much longer. The only exception to that is Elon Musk, who still keeps up this fiction. But afterward, Waymo CEO, again, the Google division, said autonomy will always have constraints, that it will be decades before these services will become widespread, and that they'll never be able to drive themselves kind of any time of year in any weather, which was the initial promise. And the Volkswagen CEO, or sorry, not CEO, one Volkswagen executive who worked on these systems, who was responsible for this division, said that level 5, which is kind of the version of autonomous driving where a human would never have to take over. The vehicle doesn't actually need a steering wheel or anything like that, because the vehicle would be able to drive itself in any road condition, weather condition, any time, anything you threw at it, it'd be able to handle. This executive said that level 5 will never happen globally, that it would be a minimum of 5 years to further develop the technology for select cities. It's been 5 years, that's still not really ready. And he also said that it would require high definition 3D mapping, that the roads would have to be basically perfect, that the weather would have to be good. And so this is a real shift from what these companies were saying to us before and what they've been promising to us. And if we look at what's been happening in the past number of months, we see that Argo AI, which was considered one of the leaders in the space and was backed by Ford and Volkswagen, has shut down. We see that Apple has scaled back its plans for a self-driving vehicle not until 2026 now. I'd be surprised if we see it then. And there's been other layoffs and things happening throughout the industry that suggest that it's not moving forward, as was kind of suggested to us. We also see that California regulators, and honestly regulators nationally in the United States, have been looking more closely at Tesla's assisted driving systems, autopilot and full self-driving they're called, saying that they are not only kind of falsely advertising their capabilities to drivers, to consumers, but also that they've been in a lot of accidents, and there's more investigations and lawsuits that are happening as a result of that. And when we look at San Francisco, General Motors and Waymo have been trialing their services there, and we're finding that there have been a lot of issues with those services that haven't always been suggested by the way that they talk about them. But people in San Francisco, the lawmakers in San Francisco, have increasingly been pushing back and saying that these things probably need to come off of the roads because they're disrupting traffic patterns and things so much. Like, they're not ready for prime time for public roads in the way that the companies are suggesting. And so, what that really tells me when I look at these examples and more broadly is that these tech fantasies distract from real solutions to these problems, right? The tech companies come out and they say, we are going to develop this technology that is going to solve all these problems that we all recognize exist in the transport system, but we're going to ensure you don't need to make kind of difficult political decisions. You don't need to go through any of that, because we're just going to create a technology that's going to address this for you. And we can see that they are not able to follow through on these things. So if we look at the Boring Company again, one example I like to point to, and I would say that this has happened in a number of cases where the Boring Company has gone to cities across the United States, said, we will build you kind of a transit system, and then it never really materializes. And so in Fort Lauderdale in 2021, the city there needed to build a new tunnel for the Brightline train system that is being built in Florida. And they went to Elon Musk's Boring Company, hoping that they would be able to do it on the cheap, right? And so by the time that they had actually signed a contract, what they had actually signed a contract for was not for a tunnel for a train, but rather for a tunnel for Teslas to go to the beach in Fort Lauderdale. Not very useful, to be honest. And what we see now more recently is it's very likely that tunnel is going absolutely nowhere. Meanwhile, the train tunnel has not been built. And of course, the recent flooding that we've seen in Fort Lauderdale just provides further proof for why that was never, a realistic expectation that would be built. If we also look at the Hyperloop, for example, this was proposed by Elon Musk in 2013. And when we go back and look at Elon Musk's statements at the time, also what he told his biographer in his biography that was published in 2015, we can see that the whole reason why he proposed this idea was that he did not want to see California build a high-speed rail network between Los Angeles and San Francisco. He wanted to disrupt that process, provide a distraction, and the Hyperloop was it. And it has been used to campaign against other high-speed rail projects, not just in the United States, but around the world as well. Even going back then, we could see that there were a number of people who could clearly see that that was not going to work. And, more recently, we've seen that now that interest rates are rising, now that, it's much harder to kind of keep funding these kind of big tech ideas that don't have much foundation to them, that a number of these startups and these companies that were trying to move forward with Hyperloop ideas have been dying and going under, right? Because this is not a realistic technology that's going to be built. It was just a distraction from high-speed rail. If we look at self-driving vehicles in particular, this is a story that was in the New York Times in 2018, and it says that the Koch brothers, which of course are, one of them has died now, but they are right-wing billionaires who make a lot of their money from oil and auto parts, did not want to see transit projects being built around the United States. And if you read the second sentence there, it says Americans for Prosperity, which is one of their organizations they were funding, counters that public transit plans waste taxpayer money on unpopular, outdated technology like trains and buses, just as the world is moving toward cleaner driverless vehicles. So they were explicitly using the kind of idea, the vision of self-driving cars to argue against further investments in public transit in dozens of campaigns across the United States, and saying that these technologies are coming, so why would we invest in an outdated system of public transportation when these autonomous cars are, going to solve it, right? And as I was saying, the narrative has changed a lot on autonomous vehicles since then, but we still see these narratives being repeated to this day. So I was in New Zealand recently where I was giving a series of talks and presentations and things. One thing that stood out to me is the Labour Party is in power there, more of a center-left party. They are proposing a new kind of light rail system for Auckland, which is the biggest city in New Zealand. And the right-wing National Party was opposed to that. And so this is a quote I want to read you from an interview, a conversation that was happening on one of their TV networks between a Labour minister and a national right-wing MP. And this national MP, she was saying, with the technology that's coming down the line, are we going to be committed to a fixed rail, old technology mode of transport? There's all sorts of autonomous vehicles, and the fact that we've got this revolution of electric vehicles that is going to solve most of our emissions problems. There are some other options that we should be considering. So, we can see that this narrative that was being used by the Koch brothers and Americans for Prosperity in 2018 and before that, hasn't gone away and is still being laundered and still being used today in 2023 to argue against transit projects, even though when it's very clear those technologies are not going to, realize the benefits that were promised or were being expected. And it's not just in the United States, but these narratives have kind of filtered around the world and infected a lot of conversations around how we're going to address these serious problems in the transport system. And so ultimately the question is, what is the future that we're headed toward? What is the future that we want to try to achieve? I would say that the tech industry is pushing us toward a more dystopian future where we're not only distracted from addressing the real problems with real solutions, but the solutions that they're offering us are making many of these problems worse. We see that the vision is for building a bunch of tunnels, and you can see how these are exclusive tunnels that are only going to be people who can pay for them if they're ever built at all. And you can see a vision where this kind of connects up gated communities, exclusive areas where only wealthy people can access, and we're kind of building this society, this city that is even further kind of tilted toward the elite and well-off people and not actually addressing real problems. We can see, like with the Cybertruck, that the proposal now is for massive electric vehicles with bulletproof glass and enhanced security features. What is the kind of world that people are imagining when they're designing vehicles like this, that this is supposed to enter into? And of course, even with renewables and battery storage, which are absolutely things that we need to address the climate crisis to reduce our emissions, but we can see how this can be used in a way where it allows the wealthy people to kind of opt out of the general problems that everyone else faces to ensure that they have their own, as one scholar I quote here says, a form of grid defection where they can move away from the grid, power themselves, not really be concerned with these bigger questions that address so many of us. And I would say if we really want to, kind of make a more equitable transport system and a more equitable society as a whole, I think that we need to challenge this constant focus on automobility and not give in to this wishful thinking that all we need is technology to solve all these problems that we have, right? We need to challenge these elite visions for mobility and refocus on things that actually address these problems and address them for everybody, right? By making a more equitable system that makes transportation and makes our cities better work for everybody. And that requires focusing on things that we know work rather than being distracted by tech solutions. Things like public transit, things like encouraging greater use of bicycles and even e-bikes. And of course, building our cities in more of a dense way where things can be more walkable and more accessible with those forms of transportation so that we don't always need to be reliant on cars. And of course, it's key that we don't get distracted by these PR campaigns by auto companies and tech companies as they have their particular visions for transportation that are serving them and their profits and benefiting them at the end of the day. And so that is the end of my presentation, but I'm more than happy to take any of your questions based on any of that. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Paris. We have lots of time for questions, and we have a bunch of questions already came in the Q&A, but let me start off with a couple myself, and then we can turn it over to the audience. And
sounds good. And I'll just
watchers,
turn off
people,
my screen.
Yeah. Thank you. And keep the questions coming in. We'll get to them pretty soon as they keep coming in. Yeah, this may be more of a rant than a question, but I just want to kind of get your. Yes, Elon Musk and all these tech bros and their fantasies and magical thinking that keep promising solutions that never occur. It amazes me that, like, after the Las Vegas Loop debacle, I mean, that cost $47 million for a 1.7 mile loop that's basically for Teslas. I just looked up our operating budget for our entire public transit authority in 1 year is about 189 million. So that would be about 25% of the budget for our local transit authority. What is it? Why does this keep happening that despite the repeated failures and overpromising, under-delivering solutions, that people keep coming to these tech elites for these solutions? Is it because we don't want to think about the hard problems? Is it the fact that they just have so much influence, some combination of the above? And then the important question is, how do we break out of this this fantasy?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a very important one, right? I think the disappointing thing is that the kind of tech industry and these influential people in the tech industry have really kind of captured a lot of our ideas of what the future should look like and how we should address various problems. And that has meant that for a long time we haven't been thinking about the real solutions that we have in front of us to address these things. And I think that part of the problem is that the political system is incentivized toward looking at kind of easy, quick fix, silver bullet solutions, even if they don't address the real problem. And I think it's been beneficial for some of our governments to ensure that they're getting close to people in the tech industry because it looks good and maybe it helps them at re-election time, even though those solutions don't actually address the real problems. As you're saying, in Las Vegas, that has not been a real solution there. I call it more like a Disneyland ride for Tesla owners. You get into this tunnel with a bunch of flashy lights and get driven, to the other end of the conference center in a Tesla. But again, in Arizona as well, where they kind of reduce the regulations on self-driving cars so that Uber and other companies would come in and test. And then as a result, a person died because they didn't have the regulations in place, and we're kind of doing the move fast and break things aspect of this, right? I would say that one thing I think is hopeful is that we are kind of moving away, or at least some of our governments are moving away toward being kind of, obsessed with what the tech companies are doing and being really distracted by them. But I think that there is still a problem where a lot of our governments get a bit too kind of, are too easily influenced by and buy into these notions and these ideas. And I think the more that we can push back on that, the more that people within cities can organize for real solutions to these problems, the easier it's going to be to push back against the influence of these tech companies and tech executives.
I mean, even looking at things like for example, I'll give a couple examples from here in Columbus, where they wanted to install a bike lane here in Columbus, and they got pushback from business owners. And despite how much evidence we brought to the table about bike lanes don't harm businesses, it was like talk to the hand. And now with Intel coming here and these massive impacts are going to happen here with housing and transportation. A month or two ago, Ohio Department of Transportation floated a second beltway around Columbus. And so there's a lot of scientific evidence to back up the fact that these things don't work, that we can't keep building our way out of congestion, that that we know the fundamental principles of movement, we know how to satisfy that in an inclusive, equitable way. What is it when we have all this scientific evidence amassed, but we still can't move the needle in some of these political conversations? Is it a problem with the way we communicate our science, or is it just the headwinds are just so tough?
Yeah, maybe communication is part of it, but I probably wouldn't see it as the core piece of it, right? I think that one of the problems is that we often talk about evidence-based decision making and things like that, right? But when we actually look at it, that's not always what wins out at the end of the day, unfortunately. I think that when we look at the problems that you're talking about, like, we have plenty of evidence that building more roads is not how we solve traffic and congestion problems, right? It's the fact that people are so dependent on cars and just have to drive to get wherever they're going to go. And when we build new roads, it just encourages people to drive more. Again, as you're saying, we have plenty of evidence that bike lanes are good things to invest in, that they are actually beneficial for businesses and everybody, really. But there's still that resistance to it. And I would say that part of that is explained. Like, I think we can look at the tech companies and see how they provide a really easy, distractible alternative that doesn't address the problem, but allows us to kind of push the problem down the road a bit more. But I think that the bigger question there is that, one, there's kind of the path dependency, right? We've been doing it this way for a long time. We're just going to keep doing it this way because this is the easy thing to do. But then I think on top of that as well is there's also a lot of kind of industry pressure and industry incentive to go in that direction, right? We keep building if we keep investing in automotive infrastructure, that keeps people buying cars and dependent on cars, that ensures that there's still profits for automotive companies and all the other companies that are dependent on cars and car dependency. And now the tech companies, of course, are getting in on this as well, not just with kind of the bigger ideas that I talked about, but also we see that, with newer cars now, there's all of these internet services are built into them. They're collecting a ton of data on drivers. That data is going back to the auto companies and the tech companies. They are selling that data to other companies to build advertising profiles on you. They are increasingly building subscription services that are built into your car so that they can make more money off you that way. So you can see that there's a whole kind of industry built around this. And this is, I think, part of the reason why it's so difficult to kind of push some of these governments to stop this investment in car and automotive infrastructure. I think that the way that you ultimately break that, the only way that you can do it, or hope to, is to have more kind of local organizing around these alternatives to try to show that there is kind of a countervailing force or some degree of pressure that can be applied to, get more wins for transit and for bicycles, because ultimately this is not going to benefit a ton of industrial interests, a ton of corporate interests in the way that continuing to invest in automotive infrastructure will.
And one last question, I'm going to turn it over to Jerica because there's a lot of questions in the Q&A, so
Sure thing.
we'll get to those really quickly. But you have a great phrase in your book. You used the term kinetic elite. The fact that a lot of our transportation technologies have basically allowed the rich to move quicker than the poor. So, here in Ohio, we're trying to be the leaders in advanced air mobility. And in fact, Ohio State's making some pushes in advanced air mobility. Talk to me about the justice and equity issues of advanced air mobility.
Yeah, I think it's a big problem, and it's clearly not going to address, all of the problems I was talking about in my presentation, and that, I'm sure you're very familiar with, and many of the viewers, right? Yeah, and that term kinetic elite, I know I took it from somebody, and I can't remember who I took it from in the book now. I'd have to go back and look at it. Another academic, of course. But yeah, so I think that the problem with the idea of these kind of air services of shifting more toward having these air transportation services that are supposedly going to address traffic congestion and reduce traffic congestion, all this is, first of all, like, it's completely unrealistic to think that we're going to start having like a ton of people using basically flying cars. Obviously there's a more technical kind of industry term on these, but that's basically what they're trying to do. They're kind of like upgraded helicopters, to give you an idea. But not only is this going to require a ton of additional infrastructure, you're going to need, the places for these vehicles to land and, to be stored. You're going to need kind of a local air authority that can coordinate where all of these vehicles are going, because they're not just going to be able to go wherever you want them to. And ultimately, obviously these companies talk as though they're going to be very affordable for people. If you listen to Uber's PR, when it used to, kind of present this vision, it sold off its air division a few years ago. But it used to say that it was going to, offer more wheelchair accessibility. It was going to serve the underserved. It was very clear that these are going to be expensive services, maybe a bit cheaper than taking a helicopter, but still not accessible to the wider public. And the question, of course, is, I think, as you're alluding to, does it really make sense to make all of this investment in this kind of air transportation infrastructure that's largely going to serve more well-off people in society, when all of that effort and that energy and that investment could be going to addressing real problems in the transport system, could be addressing the inequities that exist in the transport system, could be improving public transportation and making it so it's easier for people to get around, instead of, as we've been talking about, getting distracted by, these kind of big tech ideas that aren't really going to go anywhere.
Okay, thank you. Jerica will now step in and field some audience questions.
Perfect. So we have a couple that are the same, so I'll have you just answer some of those. I'll combine the questions. So one of them is,
Sure.
How do we help our transit agencies understand that TNCs and ride shares services are not a sustainable solution?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it can be a bit difficult, because I think that people have been really effectively misled around what these companies are doing and what these services are offering, right? And we especially see in some rural areas, some governments have even experimented with kind of getting rid of transit altogether and subsidizing Uber services, and that's been just a complete failure, a really bad decision. And so I think that part of it is recognizing that transit is an essential service, trying to make the case for that, but also ensuring that evidence is presented, and that we're able to explain why these Uber and Lyft and these other services are not actually delivering the benefits that they claim to. I think that an important aspect of this is to really look at what these companies have been doing recently as well, where, especially since interest rates have been rising and the access to cheap credit has gone away, these companies have been trying to finally, become profitable, because they've never been profitable. And that has required increasing fees and increasing prices, but also further pushing back on the, the pay that is given to drivers. And there's a larger question as to whether that is kind of the type of system that we want to be reliant on, where you're basically relying on contract labor in order to get people around, or do we want greater investment in transit services that usually have unionized drivers that are able to make a decent living, and that can actually provide better service to people if we just give them better funding and improve that service.
Thank you. So our next one is asking, it says VMT is one thing, but what about travel time? And then it seems like the rest of their question might be a little bit of a statement, but also connected. Vehicle Teslas without autopilot are shown to be safer, as well as route selection that can reduce travel time. So it says level 2 is here. So if you could talk about the differences from the vehicle's miles traveled versus the travel time, and also like with some of the safety enhancements that Tesla's made.
Sure. So on one part of that, the vehicle miles of travel is, the amount of vehicles that are being traveled on the roads, basically, right? And what we see is that these services are, there's more vehicle miles of travel that are being traveled basically by using these services. That means that there's more congestion. So that means that you're going to be stuck in traffic more often if this is what we're relying on, and if this is what more people are shifting over to. And of course, there are reasons why we used to have better regulations on taxi services, because we wanted to ensure that there was a good kind of trade-off between the benefits to the public and the benefits to the drivers, and also kind of the effect on the city, right? And so that part of the reason that there were limits on the number of taxis that were on the roads was so that there wasn't too much competition, so that drivers could make a decent living doing this, but also so that you didn't have too many vehicles on the road, so that you weren't creating all this additional traffic and affecting kind of the city in this way, right? And so obviously, when we talk about travel time as well, it depends on what your goal is here. Yeah, an Uber might arrive quicker, but there are a bunch of trade-offs that come with that, where you're affecting traffic. You're having these drivers that are being paid less, that often aren't earning as much as they would have in the past if there had been a kind of taxi service. And so I think that these are things that we need to consider as well. And if we have been making, if we do make better investments in transit and in cycling and these things like this, that can help us to relieve congestion so that people can get where they need to go quicker. And if we can improve the service frequency, the accessibility of transit, that can mean that those things can better serve people as well. And hopefully you wouldn't have to be waiting as long to use those types of services. On Tesla and the idea of level 2 automation, there have been studies that have been released by Tesla that suggest that it is safer. There's a lot of questions over the accuracy and reliability of those studies. For a long time, Tesla was promoting numbers and figures on its safety that were later proven to be incorrect and not accurate. And the other thing is that a lot of these services and these systems compare numbers that are mainly for highway driving on vehicles that are owned by well-off kind of portions of the public, because these are more expensive vehicles, to kind of general average figures for the entire driving population. And you really can't compare those two things, because highway driving has fewer collisions, fewer crashes, and more well-off people tend to also have fewer collisions, fewer crashes, and things like that as well, right? These are just what is in the stats. And so I would say that actually the idea that this is kind of settled, that Teslas are safer, is really not necessarily the case, because you're not really comparing apples and apples. You're comparing different things there with a lot of these numbers.
That was an amazing response. So we'll go to another question that I see. It's asking, what are your favorite examples of technology applications that are helping to advance equitable and sustainable transportation systems?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? And I think one of the misconceptions can be that I'm completely opposed to like new technologies being used in transportation, and that's not the case. I think that there are many ways that we can use technology to improve systems that we already have. But the question is, what is the goal, right? And are we really thinking about how we are implementing those technologies in order to address real problems? Or are we just kind of following on the narratives of these tech companies that are not really, addressing the core issues that exist in our cities, right? I think that one thing that I'm particularly interested in or kind of intrigued by in North American cities is, the use of e-bikes. There are obviously things that we need to study there, and we need to be sure that we have proper safety measures in place and whatnot to ensure that there's not a lot more crashes and people being injured by using these things. But I think that because of how our cities have been constructed, where they have largely been built for cars and where they are more spread out, that the e-bike and the additional kind of speed that they can offer can make it more accessible for people to use a bike to get where they need to go. I would say as well, I think that it's interesting. I spoke to David Zipper, who does a lot of work on transportation recently, and he was telling me about how there are camera systems that are being kind of implemented in buses in New York City and some other cities as well, where they read the license plates of cars that have kind of parked in bus lanes and things like that, and they get automatically ticketed as a result. And what they find is that often once they've been ticketed, they tend not to do that again because they've received a ticket. And so it's a good kind of use of technology to, enforce bus lanes to ensure that things are working better for transit systems. And so, yeah, I think that there are positive implementations. I think that we just need to be a bit clearer on where we're implementing that technology, what the goal is with it, and making sure that we're actually following through on those goals rather than just kind of believing what the tech companies say and not really checking and double checking that it's actually having the benefits that they claim.
Great, thank you so much. Another question that I see here is it may not make sense that the government spend on air mobility infrastructure, but the public purpose doctrine, the idea that expenditures of public money should benefit the public generally, has been significantly abandoned in many parts of America. Do you think that conjoining of government and private corporations, governance versus government or public private partnerships and regulatory parts plays a part into this? If so, have we gone too far to turn back the clock?
I would certainly not, be hopeless in saying that we've gone too far and we can't address anything. I think I still need to believe that we can address these problems and try to roll these things back, right? I think that there is a serious problem, and I think that part of the reason I talked about the history is that we can go back to the early days of the automobile and see how automotive companies have been influencing the government in order to have them kind of pass and implement policies that encourage the use of automobiles, right? And so it's not like this is kind of a recent thing that has just happened in the past couple of decades. This is kind of a century-long thing of having this relationship between automotive companies and between government. And you could kind of see automotive companies as tech companies in an earlier period, right? They are kind of releasing this new tech product onto the atmosphere or into the city, and people are believing that this is what the future is going to look like, right? And of course, in the same way that tech companies in the past 15 years had huge visions for what self-driving cars and these other things were going to mean for our cities, if you go back to the early decades of the 1900s, you can see again, these auto companies had big visions for what the future was going to look like with the automobile, and they were going to be great and wonderful. And now we're dealing with the consequences, right? And so that's just to say that I think that there has always been this relationship. And so I think that I think that that's part of the problem, right? Is that the policy has been too focused on serving the goals and the ends of these various companies who profit from a particular orientation around transportation and a particular way of building a transportation system. And that hasn't taken into account what actually benefits the public most, right? And I think that if we want to start seeing those things shift, start seeing those things move in a different direction, it will require an organized public to force government to do it, right? It's not something that they're just going to do because they feel particularly kind of altruistic or whatever, right? It requires kind of power from the public in order to push back on these corporate interests. And again, that's something that we see in the 70s, in the early 1900s, as people became organized and pushed back against highways and other kind of automotive policies. They didn't always win, but in some cases they did. And that's kind of what we need if we hope to push back against these things and get better policies. And just a final thing that I would say is that I think that our governments have been too oriented toward the private sector and toward public-private partnerships in addressing a lot of these problems. And I think that one of the things that we see time and again is that, whether it's infrastructure projects, transport infrastructure projects in the United States, we also see it up here in Canada, is that often when these public-private partnerships are undertaken, the costs just completely balloon. We're not able to kind of efficiently build anything anymore because of the way that we have kind of put these things together, over reliance on consultants, other kind of problems that have come from losing kind of public capacity to build these projects. And I think that if we really want to kind of construct better transit and think about transportation in a better way and think about how our governments are going to serve that, we do need to kind of rebuild that public capacity rather than just constantly outsourcing things to the private sector and hoping that they are going to deliver it for us.
If I can follow up with a related question, it has
Sure.
to do with public-private partnerships. Several people in the Q&A asked about micromobility, about scooters, and what you think about that. I'd like to hear your comments on that. I'd also like to hear what you have to say about bike share, because bike share is an example of public-private partnerships that a lot of us are really strong advocates for. So is that a good example of a public-private partnership, or are we doing it right in that case, or what are we doing wrong?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? And like when I think of public-private partnerships in transportation, like just very quickly, they built a light rail line here, or not here where I am, I'm thinking Canada, but in Ottawa a couple of years ago, through kind of the downtown core. And it was a public-private partnership. And it's just been an absolute mess ever since it was built. They didn't consider the fact that it gets really cold in Ottawa in the winter. And so things have not been working properly. The cars keep breaking down. It's just been an absolute mess. And it's unfortunate because what we need is greater investment in this, and what it does is ultimately push people away from transit at a moment where we need them to be taking it more, right? Because this isn't working properly. And so I think that's something that we really need to be paying attention to. I think the question on bike share is a really good one, because I think that we have had a lot of focus in the past number of years on these kind of dockless bike share services and dockless scooter services. And this was promoted as, this is the way that we're going to address, problems with transportation in our cities, encourage more cycling, more active mobility. What we've largely seen is that they have not contributed to that, right? That just littering the streets or the sidewalks with scooters and bikes is not the way that you encourage people to take these forms of transportation, because the infrastructure really wasn't in place to encourage it in the way that you say, that bicycle lanes have not been built. So, it's not just access to bicycles, it's ensuring that the infrastructure is in place that you can safely park a bike when you don't need it anymore, when you're not using it, so that there are, places where you can ride it and feel safe and that you're not going to get hit by a car or whatever. So that's not to say that bike share is a bad thing though, right? I think that actually docked bike share services that a lot of cities have had for a number of years are actually quite good in that they offer you places where you can park this bike, where it's going to be safe, where you don't need to worry about it any longer. But because of the way that these systems are designed, the bike also tends to last a lot longer. One thing that we saw with the dockless services is that they'd get kind of trashed really quickly, and there was a really high turnover in the kind of bikes and scooters. And so they were actually not that great, environmentally as a result of that, when analyses were done of the kind of environmental footprint of these services. And so one thing that you say about the bike share services, that in many cases they were public-private partnerships, and that's true. In some cases it was with advertisers. If we look at cities like like in Paris, for example, or various other, obviously we know Lyft bought a lot of the bike share services across the United States. And I would say that one of the things that has been really important in the places where bike share services, dock bike share services have been successful, is that there's been a proper regulatory infrastructure that was in place, that ensured there were particular standards for how these things were operated. And one thing that we saw with how these things were treated previous to the kind of excitement around the dockless bike share boom is that, these companies weren't expecting huge profits, that they would kind of put in the work to work with cities, to do public consultations, to ensure they knew how these services were going to roll out and how they were going to serve the public. So that work was done, and they were working closely with government. And one of the things that we saw that was a serious problem with the dockless bike share services is that they did none of that, right? They just kind of threw the vehicles out onto the streets. They didn't consider how people were going to use them. They just wanted to quickly grab market share. They often didn't talk to the cities to see what they wanted to do. And so it was a complete failure. And so I think that ideally you'd have this as part of kind of an integrated policy where you have the dock bike share service, you have greater investment in construction of bicycle lanes. You also have the construction of parking facilities where even if you're riding your own bike, you can park it there. It's going to be safe if you're going to work or going to shop or whatever. And that is really the way that you encourage it. And, I think the obvious example during the past few years is Paris, where they used the opportunity of the pandemic to just vastly expand the number of cycle lanes. And of course, what they saw was the number of people using number of people using bikes just exploded. And in the past couple of weeks, the people there voted to ban these dockless services altogether because they were just a nuisance. And so I think that shows you how you actually address these things and encourage more use of bicycles and whatnot.
Okay, thank you very much, Paris. We are out of time, so we have to say goodbye. Thank you for your presentation and for your responsiveness to the questions from the audience and from me. Again, everyone, this is the last event in our Tech in the City series. We will be having the Race in Place, Learning from the Past and Looking to the Future seminar series starting this May 12th, and in the fall, our Just Streets, Safe and Equitable Mobility in Our Communities webinar series. So again, kira.osu.edu, check us out, join our newsletter, sign up for our newsletter. That way you'll never miss any of these exciting events and also great speakers like Paris Marx. So thank you, everyone. Be well and be careful out there.
Thanks, everyone.